I almost didn't pick up the phone that evening. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making every small sound feel amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant bark of a dog, the ticking of the wall clock, it all seemed louder, sharper, accusing. I sat curled on the couch, laptop on my knees, pretending to work, scrolling through meaningless updates, when the screen blinked with Max's name. For a split second, I hesitated. There was a familiar tight knot in my chest, the one that had been there for years, always tied to expectations I had long accepted. Slowly, I lifted the receiver. "Hi, Mom," Max said. His voice was casual, too casual, like he had rehearsed it. Before I could even speak, Lena's voice cut in, calm, deliberate, chilling. "Oh, we already got married yesterday," she said, smiling through the phone. "We only invited special people." I froze. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles ached. Special people. Just 4 words, and yet they hit harder than any slap, more biting than any insult. Special people. I, who had spent the last 3 years quietly giving them everything they needed, were not special. I had paid their monthly $500 rent for years. I had filled their apartment with furniture, stocked the fridge when it was empty, and yet I was invisible, not worthy of witnessing my son's wedding. The world seemed to tilt. I looked around my living room, the one I had cleaned so meticulously, the one where I had imagined Max and Lena visiting to celebrate afterward, and there I stood, in my own home, holding a phone that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds as my son avoided my gaze. Lena, meanwhile, made herself perfectly at home on the sofa I had bought for them. I remembered the pale pink dress I had picked out, the $200 I had spent, imagining myself smiling in wedding photos that would never include me. I had set aside $1,000 for a gift, called my sister Diana to share the excitement, polished the house, even planned a little surprise for them afterward. And now all of that, every tiny detail, every hopeful thought, lay in ruins. Max finally looked at me, but his voice had that practiced, almost theatrical tone. "Mom, it was an intimate ceremony, just the 2 of us and the witnesses." Lies. I had already seen the photos online. Lena's parents smiling proudly, her siblings raising champagne flutes, and there was Lena, in the dress I had partially funded with $800, glowing as if I didn't exist. A week later, the world flipped again. Lena called me, but this time her voice had changed, desperate, trembling. "Renata, the rent. It's overdue. The landlord is threatening to kick us out. You forgot the transfer." For a moment, I remained silent. All those late-night trips to the bank, all the times I had scrimped and saved to make sure they had a roof over their heads, flashed through my mind. And yet here she was, speaking to me as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just humiliated me publicly. I found a strange calm in myself. "Lena," I said, the words measured, cold, "didn't I warn you that I only help special people?" There was silence, a silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. "What? We were always special to you," she stammered. "You're like a second mom to me." Lies, all lies. Sweet words only spoken when money or help was needed, words that had always come with a price. I remembered every dollar, every favor, every sacrifice I had made. $500 a month rent for 36 months, $18,000. Food and groceries, roughly $200 a month, $7,200. Birthday and holiday gifts, $3,000. Medical expenses, car loans, furniture, repairs, adding up to a staggering $33,400. All gone. And for what? Respect? Gratitude? A place at their wedding? None of it. That night I cried, but not out of sorrow, not entirely. These were tears of rage, tears for years of being invisible, used, and dismissed. Tears for a love that had been reduced to numbers in a ledger. The next morning, something inside me shifted. I looked in the mirror and saw my own eyes, tired but sharp, familiar yet newly resolute. I had been compliant for decades, giving without limits, hoping affection could be bought. Now, the thought of them no longer controlling my life filled me with a quiet, burning determination. For the first time in years, I thought of myself first. I made coffee and drank it slowly, without checking my phone, without wondering if Max or Lena had sent a message. For the first time, the world did not revolve around their needs. I sat at the table where I had once counted bills for them, calculated their expenses, cried silently when they dismissed me, and now, this table bore witness to something different. I pulled out my checkbook, bank statements, and began tallying my lifetime of generosity. The sum was sobering, staggering. $33,400 I had given, expecting nothing more than love and respect in return. The phone rang. Max. Normally, I would have answered instantly, but not today. I let it ring, once, twice, 3 times. Finally, silence. Then Lena called. Same result. Finally, a text. "Mom, please answer. We need to talk." I deleted it without hesitation. At 2 p.m., I stepped outside for a walk. The first one I had taken without errands, obligations, or expectations for them. I passed the park where I had pushed Max on swings, where he had run into my arms laughing, where he had once called me the best mom in the world. When had that boy become a man who treated me like an ATM? When had love become currency? At the bank, I paused outside the glass doors, noticing Mr. Klenn, the branch manager who had seen every transfer I made, every dollar I gave, every time I sacrificed my own comfort for them. Today, I didn't move to the door. Today, I just stood there, breathing, feeling something I hadn't felt in years: power, clarity, and the beginning of my reckoning. I walked slowly back home, the winter sun brushing my face but failing to warm the storm brewing inside me. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of clarity. The more I thought about Lena's smug smile and Max's rehearsed words, the colder my resolve became. I had spent decades giving, bending over backward to keep the people I loved happy. And now? I was the ghost of my own generosity, invisible, forgotten, used. Back in my kitchen, I sat at the table again, but this time with a different purpose. The ledger, my checkbook, and the piles of receipts became weapons. I ran the numbers over and over, each sum like a sting, each total a betrayal. $33,400. That's what I had spent on them over the years. Money I had scrimped, saved, and set aside from my own modest life. Money I had imagined as a bridge to love, respect, and appreciation. And for what? To be excluded from their wedding, lied to, and treated like I was disposable. A memory flared sharply. Max, as a child, hugging me tight, whispering that I was the best mom in the world. And now, this man, his voice polite but distant, hiding behind rehearsed words while Lena's lies dripped from her tone like poison. The betrayal was complete. I poured another cup of coffee and allowed myself a slow, simmering calm. Anger, yes, but controlled, purposeful anger, the kind that sharpens the mind instead of destroying it. I had been reactive for too long, always giving, always excusing, always waiting for the scraps of affection they tossed my way. That was over. I started making a plan. Not a revenge plan, not yet, but a map of my priorities. This time, it would be about me, my well-being, my dignity. No more paying rent, no more buying groceries or furniture at their whim, no more loans that would vanish into their careless pockets. The first step was simple: stop. I wrote a letter, not to be sent immediately, but to purge the ache in my chest. Max, Lena, after years of bending over backward, I've realized that love cannot be bought, respect cannot be forced, and neither can inclusion in a life I helped build financially, emotionally, and mentally. I am done being invisible. I am done being your bank account. I am done being used. The act of writing brought a strange relief, but also a sharp fear. Fear that Max would never forgive me. Fear that the family I loved so deeply would fracture irreparably. But even that fear was smaller than the shame I felt for allowing them to walk over me for so long. The following day, Max came over. I had not answered his calls, not returned texts, and I was fully prepared to continue ignoring him. Yet, here he was, standing at my front door, the polite, rehearsed smile still plastered across his face. "Mom," he began, his voice hesitant. I didn't invite him in. I didn't even move. I just looked at him, the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders, the cold fire in my eyes warning him that this was not the mother he once manipulated so easily. We need to talk," he said again, the words faltering. "You should have thought of that before you excluded me from your wedding," I said, calm but cutting. My words landed like hammers, deliberate and heavy. Max shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, Lena, she didn't mean—" "Don't," I interrupted, my voice quiet but steely. "Don't tell me what Lena meant. Don't tell me what your intentions were. All I see is the truth. Years of giving, ignored. Weeks of planning, discarded. And that smile, Max. That smile when you said only special people were invited. Do you know how that felt?" Max looked down, and I could see the first flicker of guilt in his eyes. Not shame, not real understanding, but a crack. A tiny human crack in the wall they had built around themselves. I'm sorry, Mom," he murmured, but his words felt empty, too rehearsed, too convenient. They couldn't undo the humiliation, the betrayal, or the years of being treated like a doormat. I closed the door gently, almost mechanically, letting the sound of it click into place feel like a boundary being drawn. He would have to knock again, but on my terms. Not because I wanted to serve them, but because I wanted to decide if they deserved my time and attention. Over the next few days, I immersed myself in reflection. I started a journal, writing down every instance of manipulation, every time my generosity had been weaponized against me, every time they had taken for granted what I offered. Each page was a testament to my life, but also a blueprint for my reclamation. I made small, deliberate changes. I canceled automatic bank transfers. I stopped running errands for them that were not urgent emergencies. I began cooking for myself, not for them. I walked the park again, feeling the sun on my face and noticing for the first time how beautiful the winter light could be when you were looking at it for yourself, not through the lens of what you could give to others. Then came the first confrontation. Lena called, her voice trembling. "Renata, please, we really need your help this time." I smiled softly, a small, private smile of victory. "Only special people, Lena," I said. The silence on the other end was so deep I could almost hear her panic, taste her disbelief. For the first time, I held the power, and it felt intoxicating. Max called again that night. I let the phone ring, and then I deleted the message. That night, I lay in bed, not sad, not anxious, but resolute. I was learning a new rhythm, one where my needs came first. A rhythm where my generosity would no longer be a weapon against me. And somewhere in that new rhythm, a plan began to form. A plan not born of vengeance, but of truth, confrontation, and finally reclaiming my life. Tomorrow, I would make a list. Not a list of what they owed me, but a list of what I would no longer tolerate, and I would stick to it. The morning air was crisp, carrying a hint of frost that stung my cheeks as I stepped outside. I walked slowly, deliberately, taking in the world without the usual weight of obligation pressing down on me. It was strange, almost disorienting, to feel the freedom of walking without errands or guilt. For years, my life had been dictated by their needs: transfers, groceries, repairs, medical bills, minor emergencies I had always jumped at. And now, nothing. I returned home and sat at my kitchen table, pulling out my journal. I wrote with deliberate force, each sentence a hammer shaping my resolve. I will not be invisible. I will not be used. I will not allow anyone, not Max, not Lena, to dictate my worth or my actions. It was more than words. It was a declaration. My pen moved faster, sharper, as the anger I had buried for years boiled into clarity. Then the phone rang. Lena. I didn't answer. I didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, I continued writing, counting every time I had been taken for granted, listing each sacrifice that had gone unappreciated. Max came by that afternoon. I had not called him. I had not invited him. He knocked gently, but I did not rush to the door. "Mom, I want to explain," he said when I finally opened it, his posture hesitant, almost submissive. I studied him carefully. The boy who had once laughed at my jokes, who had leaned on me like a child, had become a man who assumed I would always be there. But not today. "Max," I said evenly, "do you know why I didn't answer your calls?" He swallowed hard. "Because you were angry?" "Because I am not anyone's backup plan, Max. Not anymore." My voice was calm but heavy with truth. "Do you know how it feels to be excluded from the most important day of your own son's life? To discover your love and generosity meant nothing?" His gaze faltered. I could see the weight of guilt pressing down, but I could also see how used he was to my silent compliance. Mom, I didn't think." His words trailed off. "That's the problem, Max. You didn't think," I said, stepping aside to let him enter, but only because I wanted to. "For years, I did everything for you without question. I gave, I saved, I sacrificed. And for what? To be dismissed?" Max sat down, shifting uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. There was no easy excuse this time, no rehearsed line, no appeal to my softness. I had changed. Over the next days, I began a series of small but deliberate actions. I canceled automatic transfers to their account. I stopped buying groceries, furniture, and supplies for them. I refused minor favors they had come to take for granted. At first, Lena's calls were frantic, pleading. "Renata, please, just this once. We really need your help." I smiled quietly to myself and said nothing. Let the panic sink in. Let them feel the absence they had so long ignored. Max's messages grew more urgent. "Mom, please, we'll explain. We need your support." I deleted each one. I did not feel guilty. For the first time in years, I realized that their urgency was not my responsibility. Then came the first real test. Lena had left her phone at home when she visited a friend, and Max had to call me from her number. He tried the old tactic, pleading, cajoling, claiming emergencies, but I stayed firm. "I will only help if you treat me with respect," I said, my voice steady. "Otherwise, I am done." I could hear the hesitation on the other end, the uncertainty creeping into his words. They were accustomed to instant compliance. For the first time, they were faced with resistance. That evening, I sat alone in my living room, reviewing the financial ledger again. Every transaction, every dollar spent told a story, not of love, not of familial duty, but of exploitation. I had allowed my generosity to be weaponized against me, and now it was time to reclaim it. I began planning how to confront them about the money, the manipulation, and the betrayal. But this time, I would do it on my terms, with preparation, precision, and patience. I knew they would not change overnight. They were used to taking, but I was learning to take back control. The next morning, I received a knock on the door. Max, alone. No rehearsed words, no shield of Lena's presence. I opened the door slowly, letting the moment stretch. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I nodded once, calmly, and invited him inside. The house felt different now, quieter in a way that made space for truth. "Max, you excluded me from your wedding," I said, sitting down across from him at the table. "I saw the photos. I gave you everything, and I got nothing. And now, you come here expecting things to be normal?" He swallowed hard. I made a mistake, Mom. I didn't realize. We didn't think." I held up my hand. "Don't. Just listen. Listen to the truth. For the first time in years, I will speak it without sugarcoating. I gave $33,400 to you and Lena over 3 years. That includes rent, groceries, gifts, medical bills, furniture, everything. And for what? A seat at your wedding? A simple acknowledgment? A word of thanks?" Max flinched, his lips pressed together. He couldn't hide the guilt, though he tried. "I will no longer be invisible. I will no longer be taken for granted. If you want my help, my presence, or even my attention, you will show me respect. You will not manipulate me. You will not lie to me, and you will not expect my generosity as a right." He nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. It was a start. That night, as I sat alone, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: empowerment. Not vindictive, not cruel, just pure clarity. I had drawn the line. They could cross it, they could resist it, but I would not back down. For the first time, I was no longer a silent participant in their lives. I was a force of consequence, and the ripples of my newfound boundaries were already beginning to hit them. The following morning, I woke up with a purpose I had never felt before. I dressed quickly, not for errands or favors, but for myself. Breakfast was quiet, solitary, no calls, no requests, no interruptions. Just me, my coffee, and the weight of clarity. I pulled out my financial ledger once more. $33,400. Every penny spent was accounted for, every transaction carefully noted. I had been generous to the point of self-erasure, and now it was time to confront the truth. Not just with Max, but with Lena too. I made a call. Lena answered immediately, her voice sharp and sweet, like sugar hiding vinegar. "Renata, finally you're answering. We really—" "Stop," I interrupted. The calmness in my tone made her pause. "I am done pretending that everything is fine. I am done covering for your mistakes. I am done being invisible." There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear her panic. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quivering. "I mean, Lena, that I will no longer fund your life, pay your rent, buy your furniture, or cover your emergencies. Over the past 3 years, I have given you and Max $33,400. $33,400. And yet, when it came to your wedding, I was excluded. Not one word, not one invitation. You call me for money, but you do not call me for love. You do not call me for respect. And that ends now." Lena's voice trembled. "Renata, please, I didn't realize it would hurt you like that. We thought—" "Stop making excuses. Stop hiding behind your assumptions. I want the money accounted for. I want acknowledgment. And I want respect." Her silence was long and deafening. For the first time, she realized that I was serious, that the quiet, compliant woman she had exploited for years no longer existed. The next day, I decided to take the confrontation in person. Max and Lena were at home, presumably planning some small domestic routine, oblivious to the storm that had been brewing silently for weeks. I arrived unannounced, carrying my ledger and my phone, ready to record a detailed account of everything I had given them. Max answered the door, his polite smile fading as he noticed the steely determination in my eyes. "Mom, we can talk inside." "No," I interrupted. "We will talk here, where you can't hide behind walls, where you can't pretend your misdeeds are invisible." I laid the ledger on the table, flipping through pages filled with meticulous notes. Rent, groceries, gifts, emergencies, furniture, loans. Each number a testament to my life of giving, each sum a mark of their exploitation. "Do you see this?" I asked, my voice firm. "This is what I gave you. This is the cost of being invisible to your own mother. And yet, you excluded me from your wedding, lied to me, and acted as if I did not exist. Do you understand how that feels?" Max shifted uncomfortably, looking down. Lena's face had gone pale, her confident posture replaced with tension. For once, they couldn't charm or manipulate their way out. We didn't mean to hurt you," Max mumbled. "I don't care what you meant. I care about what you did. And the truth is simple. Your actions show who you really value, and it isn't me. So now you will face the consequences of your choices." Lena opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. "No, you will listen. I will no longer be your financial crutch, your emergency plan, or your invisible presence. You will make your own mistakes, face your own emergencies, and live with the consequences. And maybe then, you will understand what it means to treat someone like family instead of a resource." They were silent. I could see the panic in Lena's eyes, the uncertainty in Max's posture. For the first time in years, they felt powerless. And it was exquisite. Not because I enjoyed their suffering, but because I had finally reclaimed my own power. Later that evening, Lena called. Her voice was shaky, almost desperate. "Renata, please, we really need help. We can't pay the rent." I sat back in my chair, coffee in hand, and smiled quietly to myself. "Only special people, Lena," I said. The silence on the line stretched long enough to taste. For the first time, they understood that my help was no longer automatic. My love was not a commodity to be exploited. My generosity was no longer their entitlement. Max texted later that night. "Mom, we'll make it right. Please, just let us explain." I deleted the message without hesitation. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the transformation that had begun. The fear, the guilt, the manipulation, they had all been stripped away by my newfound clarity. I was no longer the silent, giving, compliant woman. I was Renata, a mother who demanded respect, acknowledgment, and truth. And I would not stop until they understood that some lines, once crossed, were permanent. The next morning, I woke with a plan not born of revenge, but of justice, clarity, and self-preservation. I would confront them not just emotionally, but strategically. I would make sure that the years of exploitation were acknowledged, accounted for, and never repeated. As I sipped my coffee and looked out the window at the quiet street, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: anticipation. This was not just about Max and Lena anymore. This was about me, my dignity, and reclaiming the life I had allowed others to control for far too long. And I was ready. The morning air felt sharper than usual, carrying with it a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with errands or obligations. I walked to the park, observing families laughing, children running, and couples strolling hand in hand. For the first time, I was not thinking of Max or Lena, not calculating what I could do for them, not worrying if they were happy. I was thinking only of myself, and it felt liberating. Returning home, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table. My ledger lay open before me, numbers and receipts spread across the surface like a battlefield map. I had given everything: time, money, love, and now they had to face the reality of their choices. It was time to draw the line. Time to make them understand that my generosity was not an infinite resource to be exploited. I picked up the phone and called Max first. "Mom," he said, relief in his voice. "Please, just hear me out." "No, Max," I said firmly. "I've heard enough. I've seen enough. You and Lena have crossed a line that cannot be ignored. From this moment on, there will be rules, clear rules, and you will follow them if you expect any part of my help or any part of my life." Max's voice faltered. "Rules? Mom, we're sorry." "Sorry doesn't erase the $33,400 I've given you, the lies, the exclusion, or the humiliation. You will no longer expect automatic help. You will no longer treat me as an ATM. You will acknowledge your mistakes, account for your debt, and treat me with respect. Only then can we even begin to rebuild our relationship." There was silence. I could almost hear him struggling to find words that would absolve him of years of entitlement. Later that afternoon, Lena called, her voice trembling. "Renata, please, just this once. We really need—" I cut her off. "No, you will not use desperation to manipulate me. From now on, if you need anything, you will ask respectfully. If you disrespect me, ignore me, or lie, there will be consequences. And yes, those consequences are real." I could hear the panic in her voice. For the first time, she realized that her old tactics no longer worked. My silence hung in the air like a warning. That evening, Max came over again, alone. I let him in this time, but only because I wanted to. The house felt charged, heavy with anticipation. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "we want to make things right. Please, just tell us what to do." I placed the ledger on the table. "Here is the first step. I want a full accounting of everything you've spent since I started supporting you. Every purchase, every loan, every small gift you've received from me. I want transparency. I want honesty. And I want proof that you understand the weight of your actions." Max opened his mouth to protest, then realized that there was no argument to make. He nodded reluctantly. The next day, I began implementing stricter boundaries. I stopped picking up their calls immediately. I refused non-urgent visits. I didn't run to the bank or the store for them. Each time they reached out, I paused, letting them feel the tension, the absence they had ignored for so long. Lena's desperation escalated. Calls in the morning, texts in the afternoon, frantic pleas at night. "Renata, please, just this once. We really need your help. I'll pay you back, I promise." I smiled quietly, sipping my coffee. "Only special people, Lena," I said. Silence followed, heavy and complete. Max's demeanor shifted. He began to show signs of frustration, but also the first glimmer of understanding. He was learning, slowly, that my generosity was not infinite, that my love could not be manipulated, and that my boundaries were non-negotiable. By the end of the week, the first real consequences hit. Rent remained unpaid. Grocery shelves were bare. Lena and Max felt the discomfort they had never tolerated when I had been silently covering for them. They called repeatedly, pleading, negotiating, bargaining, but I remained firm. And in that firmness, I discovered a new power. Not cruelty, not vengeance, but clarity, justice, and self-respect. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a passive participant in their lives. I was a mother who demanded acknowledgment, accountability, and respect, and they would finally learn what it meant to face the consequences of their actions. That night, as I prepared for bed, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. I knew the battle was far from over. There would be arguments, tears, and maybe even ultimatums from them. But I had drawn the line. I had reclaimed control of my life, and for the first time in years, I slept not with anxiety or obligation pressing on my chest, but with a sense of power, clarity, and liberation. The ripples of change had begun, and I was ready to see just how far they would go. The days that followed were tense, electric with the unspoken friction between us. For the first time in years, I watched my own home, my sanctuary, transform into a battlefield of accountability. Max and Lena's repeated attempts to bypass my boundaries were met with nothing but silence, a silence that spoke volumes. They were no longer in control. I was. Lena's desperation escalated in almost cinematic fashion. Calls early in the morning, texts scattered across the day, even messages on social media tagging me indirectly, pleading, begging, cajoling. "Renata, we're really in trouble. The landlord, please just help us this one time. I'll make it up to you." I sipped my coffee quietly, the ledger before me, noting each escalation. Every plea, every manipulation attempt, every desperate lie was cataloged in meticulous detail. For the first time, I realized that documenting these interactions was not just about numbers. It was about proof, about clarity, about a record that showed exactly how far they had taken me for granted, and it was exhilarating. Max, however, began to respond differently. The rehearsed, casual tone I had heard so often was replaced by hesitation, frustration, and, surprisingly, glimpses of genuine remorse. He sent texts that were longer, more honest. "Mom, we know we've taken advantage of you. I didn't realize how much pain we caused. Please, tell us what we need to do." I didn't answer immediately. I let the message sit. Let him stew in the discomfort of waiting, in the realization that my attention was no longer a given. I was teaching them, slowly but surely, that my presence and my support had boundaries, boundaries they had ignored for too long. Then came the turning point. One evening, Lena arrived at my door unannounced, her face pale and frantic. She held a folder in her hands, a small, desperate prop in her bid to manipulate me once again. "Renata, please. We need to talk. "I brought everything," she said, voice trembling. "Proof, receipts, explanations. Just hear me out. We can fix this. We'll pay you back." I studied her carefully. The confident, commanding woman I had known for years was gone, replaced with fear and desperation. This was the first time she truly felt powerless in my presence, and it gave me a quiet satisfaction I hadn't anticipated. "Sit down, Lena," I said calmly. "I will hear what you have to say, but know this. The era of blind trust is over. The era of unquestioned generosity is over. You will show me respect. You will account for everything you've taken, and you will face the consequences of your actions." Her hands trembled as she placed the folder on the table. I flipped through it slowly, deliberately, taking in the receipts, the lists, the justifications, every attempt she had made to cover for her own recklessness. And yet, despite all her documentation, one thing was glaringly absent: acknowledgment of the emotional damage, the exclusion, the humiliation. "This isn't just about money," I said, my voice calm but firm. "It's about respect. It's about honesty. It's about recognizing the sacrifices made without expectation of immediate return. You have failed at every one of these." She looked down, shame beginning to creep into her posture. For the first time, she was truly confronted by the consequences of her manipulation. Later that night, Max called again. This time, there was no pretense, no rehearsed lines, no casual tones. His voice cracked, tentative but sincere. "Mom, I see it now. We were wrong. I want to fix this. I want to understand what it means to be responsible, to be accountable. Please, guide us." I didn't answer immediately. I wanted him to feel the weight of his words, the gravity of the situation. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, deliberate. "Max, acknowledgement is the first step. Action is the second. Respect is the foundation. You will begin by accounting for every dollar, every favor, every instance where my generosity was exploited. Only then can we discuss repayment or reconciliation." The next morning, I began to plan my strategic moves. This was no longer about reaction. This was about control, structure, and empowerment. I would map out the entire process: documentation, confrontation, repayment plan, boundaries that could never again be ignored. I took out a fresh notebook and began writing. Step 1. Document every transaction, interaction, and incident. Step 2. Confront them with clarity and authority. Step 3. Demand acknowledgement and repayment, not just financially, but emotionally. Step 4. Set unbreakable boundaries for the future. For the first time in years, I felt the thrill of intellectual and emotional strategy, the kind of power that comes from clarity and self-respect. I wasn't angry, I was focused. I wasn't vengeful, I was precise. That evening, I walked through the park again. The crisp air felt different now, charged with purpose. Children ran past, couples strolled hand in hand, but I no longer measured their happiness against my own sacrifices. I was finally free of that burden. I knew the coming weeks would be tense. There would be arguments, manipulation attempts, emotional blackmail. But I was ready. I had the ledger, the documentation, and the clarity of my own power. I would see this through, not for revenge, but for justice, dignity, and self-respect. And as I walked home, the sun setting behind the trees, I realized that I had entered a new chapter of my life. One where I was no longer invisible. One where my generosity had boundaries. One where my presence demanded acknowledgement. Max and Lena were about to learn, in the most personal way possible, that a mother's love is not infinite, not when it is taken for granted, manipulated, and dismissed. And for the first time, I felt a quiet, unshakable satisfaction in knowing that the balance of power had shifted. The morning sun cut sharply through my kitchen window, illuminating the ledger spread across the table. Each number, each receipt, each scribbled note was a reminder of the years I had given without expectation. But this morning, it wasn't about the past. It was about the future, my future, on my terms. I dialed Max's number. His voice answered after 2 rings, tentative and nervous. "Mom." "Max," I said, my tone calm but resolute. We're going to settle this. The ledger, the money, the years of support. It all has to be accounted for. I am not asking. I am demanding transparency, acknowledgement, and repayment." There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that tells you someone has finally realized the gravity of their actions. We'll do it," he said at last, his voice shaky. "Good," I said. "I expect a full list of expenses and a proposed repayment schedule on my desk by the end of the week. No excuses, no delays. And Max." "Yes?" "Respect. Treat me with honesty. Treat me with accountability. Treat me as the mother who gave you everything, not as an ATM or a servant." Max swallowed audibly. "Understood." Hanging up, I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered with the awareness that the real challenge was just beginning. Lena's calls escalated almost immediately afterward. Pleading, bargaining, frantic texts. But this time, I didn't answer. I had set the rules, and they were hers to follow. Later that day, I received the first payment proposal from Max. It was carefully calculated, conservative, almost apologetic, but it was a start. I studied it carefully. Every number, every installment, every date was analyzed. It was imperfect, but it was acknowledgement. And for the first time, acknowledgement carried weight. I called Max again. "This is a start," I said, "but we need to adjust the plan. You will take responsibility for every cent. You will commit to a schedule that reflects your respect for what has been lost and the effort I have put in over the years." We negotiated terms, not angrily, not vindictively, but firmly. I was no longer a passive participant. I was the orchestrator, the authority, the one setting the boundaries and enforcing consequences. Meanwhile, Lena's panic reached a crescendo. Calls, messages, even unscheduled visits, all met with the same unwavering stance. I would not be manipulated. I would not be rushed. I would not allow fear to dictate my generosity. Max began to understand the gravity of the situation. The lessons I had tried to teach him subtly over the years were finally sinking in. He called more frequently, not to ask for money, but to discuss the repayment schedule, to show accountability, to demonstrate that he was taking this seriously. One evening, I invited them both to sit down in the living room. The ledger was laid out, receipts in neat stacks, the air heavy with tension. "Tonight, we discuss progress and accountability," I said, calm but firm. "I want honesty, I want acknowledgement, and I want respect. If you cannot provide these, we will stop right here, and you will face the consequences of your choices without my assistance." Lena's face paled, Max's eyes were wide, but they nodded. For the first time, the dynamics had shifted. They were no longer in control. I was. As the conversation unfolded, I listened carefully, corrected discrepancies, demanded clarity, and enforced boundaries. Each correction, each insistence on honesty, reinforced my position. I was no longer bending over backward to protect their comfort. I was protecting my dignity and my life. By the end of the night, a repayment schedule was agreed upon. Not perfect, not ideal, but enforceable. Max and Lena had begun to see that my generosity had limits, and that respect and acknowledgement were non-negotiable. Later, alone in my living room, I reflected on the week. The tension, the panic, the desperate pleas, they had all been tools used against me for years. And now, I was using clarity, boundaries, and strategic enforcement to reclaim what was mine: control, respect, and peace of mind. I realized that this was not about punishment. It was about restoration, about setting the record straight, about teaching them, in a way they could never forget, that a mother's love is precious and not to be exploited. I made a mental note of the next steps: monitoring repayments, maintaining boundaries, and preparing for any attempts to circumvent the rules. Each step, each interaction, was now carefully measured. Every action was deliberate. Every word counted. I was no longer the passive provider. I was the architect of consequences, and Max and Lena were learning that reality had changed. As I sipped my coffee that night, I felt a sense of calm authority. The first real steps had been taken. The boundaries were enforced. The consequences were clear, and the lesson had begun to sink in. For the first time in years, I was in control of my life, my generosity, and my respect. And I knew that the next weeks would test them further, but I was ready. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no turning back. The morning light poured into my living room, but I barely noticed it. My focus was elsewhere, on the ledger, on the receipts, on the patterns of manipulation that had defined years of my life. I had spent so long giving blindly, sacrificing for their comfort, excusing lies and omissions, and now the scales were finally tilting. Max and Lena had begun to feel the full weight of their actions. It was subtle at first, hesitation in their words, uncertainty in their expressions, a nervousness that hadn't been there before, and I watched it carefully. Every reaction was a mirror, reflecting their growing awareness that I was no longer the mother who would silently comply. That afternoon, I called Max. "We're not done," I said simply. "I want full accountability. I want honesty about every dollar, every favor, every emergency you've presented as a crisis. I want acknowledgment for every way you've taken me for granted." There was a long pause. Then he spoke, his voice low and sincere. "Mom, I see it now. We've been selfish. We didn't realize how much we relied on you. I want to fix it. I want to make things right." I let him speak, carefully listening, not interrupting, not placating, not forgiving prematurely. For the first time, I realized that true authority doesn't shout, it commands quietly, deliberately, through presence, clarity, and unwavering boundaries. Later, Lena came over. Her usual confident demeanor was gone. Panic and shame had replaced it. She set a folder on the table, one she claimed contained all receipts and explanations. I opened it slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch, letting her feel the weight of her own actions. "This is a start," I said calmly, "but acknowledgement is not just numbers. It's words, actions, respect. You cannot erase years of manipulation with receipts alone." Her hands trembled as she nodded, the panic in her eyes almost tangible. I understand," she whispered. I leaned forward, voice measured but firm. "Do you? Really? Understand that for years I gave without asking, sacrificed without complaint, and yet I was invisible. That ends now. Respect, honesty, and accountability are non-negotiable. If you cannot meet these, you will face the consequences of your choices alone." For the first time, I felt a sense of power that wasn't just financial or strategic. It was emotional, moral, and absolute. I wasn't angry. I was precise. I wasn't vindictive. I was deliberate. That evening, Max called again, this time with a different tone. There was no casual pretense, no rehearsed politeness. "Mom, we've reviewed the ledger. We've started the repayment schedule. I want to make things right. Please, guide us through this." I paused. I let the silence stretch, making him realize that my attention was not a given. "Max, guidance is earned," I said finally. "You will follow the repayment plan. You will maintain honesty and respect. And you will never again assume my love or support is infinite. That is the only way forward." Days passed. Repayments began, boundaries were enforced, and for the first time, I felt a profound sense of liberation. Max and Lena were learning, slowly, painfully, that I was no longer the passive, compliant figure they had once exploited. Every attempt at manipulation was met with calm resistance, every plea with measured consequence. I walked through the house, finally noticing the quiet spaces I had once filled with their needs. No longer was I consumed by their emergencies or demands. The air felt lighter, cleaner, freer. I was reclaiming my home, my time, my energy. One evening, as I reviewed the repayment plan, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't just about money. It was about teaching them to respect me, to understand accountability, to see me as a human being, not a resource. And in that realization, I felt a deep, almost serene satisfaction. The final confrontation was approaching, not explosive, not dramatic, but deliberate and inevitable. Max and Lena would be forced to face the consequences of years of neglecting boundaries, exploiting generosity, and taking love for granted. And I would be ready, calm, and unyielding. For the first time, I saw clearly what my role had been for decades, a silent enabler. And for the first time, I saw clearly what it would be now, an authoritative, self-respecting force who would not tolerate exploitation, manipulation, or disrespect. I made notes for the final steps, enforcing repayments, maintaining strict boundaries, and observing their accountability. I would not intervene emotionally, financially, or physically unless they demonstrated true acknowledgment and respect. The balance of power had shifted completely. I was no longer invisible, no longer passive, and no longer taken for granted. And as I sipped my evening tea, I felt the quiet, unshakable certainty that the reckoning was not only near, it was inevitable. The house was quiet that morning, but the tension was palpable. I could feel it in the walls, in the air, in the ledger sitting heavily on the kitchen table. Max and Lena had begun to understand, slowly but painfully, that my patience had limits, and those limits had been reached. The phone rang, a shrill reminder that the reckoning was about to begin. Max's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring twice, 3 times, before answering, my voice calm, steady, and deliberate. "Mom." His voice was tentative, unsure, fragile. "Yes, Max," I said. "We need to settle everything today. Not just the repayment, not just the accountability, but the truth. I want honesty. I want acknowledgement, and I want respect. Do you understand?" "Yes," he said, swallowing audibly. We understand." I instructed him to come over immediately, and he arrived within the hour. Lena followed shortly after, her usual confidence replaced with panic, guilt, and fear. I let them sit silently across from me, letting the weight of my gaze settle over them like a heavy blanket. "I want to review every transaction, every favor, every instance where my generosity was taken for granted," I said, opening the ledger. "We will go line by line. Every omission, every lie, every exclusion from my life will be addressed. And when we are done, I expect a plan, not excuses, not justifications, not tears, but a plan to make things right." Max's hands trembled slightly as he opened his own notebook, filled with notes, receipts, and attempts at explanations. Lena clutched her folder tightly, her knuckles white. For the first time, they were truly accountable, truly vulnerable. Line by line, entry by entry, we went through the ledger. I corrected discrepancies, demanded clarification, and pointed out every instance of manipulation and entitlement. Each correction, each demand, was delivered calmly, with precision, and without a hint of anger. Yet the weight of my authority was undeniable. "This," I said, pointing to a series of apartment repair expenses I had covered, "is not charity. It is not generosity. It is responsibility I assumed for you. And yet, you treated it as a right, not a gift. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, Mom," Max said quietly, head bowed. "And these expenses," I continued, flipping through receipts for groceries, gifts, and medical emergencies, "were never trivial. They were sacrifices that were ignored, forgotten, and in your case, used against me. Do you understand the impact?" Lena's voice wavered. I see it now. I didn't understand." "You will see it," I said firmly. "Not just today, not just now, but every day you choose to ignore respect and accountability. This is not about punishment. It is about teaching responsibility, honesty, and boundaries. You cannot manipulate what you do not respect, and you cannot respect what you do not acknowledge." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Fear, shame, and realization settled over them, heavy and undeniable. For the first time, they were powerless in my presence. They had no rehearsed excuses, no diversion, no charm to evade the truth. "We will repay you," Max whispered, voice breaking slightly. "We'll follow your plan. You will follow the plan I set, Max," I interrupted gently but firmly. "And you will honor every deadline, every commitment, and every acknowledgement of responsibility. There is no negotiation. There is no bending the rules this time." Lena nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We understand, Renata. We will do it." "Good," I said, closing the ledger. "Now we will move forward, but only on these terms. Respect, honesty, accountability, and acknowledgement are non-negotiable. My generosity will never again be taken for granted. My love will not be exploited. And if you fail, you will face the consequences alone." For the first time, silence filled the room, but it was different from before. It was calm, deliberate, and heavy with understanding. Max and Lena were not simply listening, they were learning, finally comprehending the weight of their actions and the authority of the woman they had taken for granted. I leaned back, feeling a profound sense of control. Not cruelty, not vengeance, but clarity, justice, and empowerment. I had reclaimed my role, my dignity, and my boundaries, and the lesson had been taught in full. Later, as I walked through the house alone, I reflected on the transformation. For decades, I had been invisible, silent, and exploited. Now I was seen, heard, and respected. The balance of power had shifted, and there was no going back. Max and Lena would continue to learn, continue to face the consequences, and continue to understand the value of honesty, respect, and acknowledgement. And I, for the first time in years, was free. Free from manipulation, free from exploitation, free to live on my own terms, with dignity intact, authority established, and boundaries respected. This was more than a confrontation. It was a reckoning, a shift, a reclamation of life, respect, and self-worth. And as I sipped my evening tea, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The lesson had been delivered, the consequences were clear, and I was finally, completely in control. The days that followed the confrontation were quieter, but not without purpose. Max and Lena had begun the repayment process, and each installment, each acknowledgement, was a step toward rebuilding what had been damaged. But more importantly, it was a step toward respecting boundaries that had long been ignored. For the first time, I experienced mornings without anxiety, without calls demanding immediate action, without the constant weight of their emergencies pressing on my shoulders. The house, once a stage for silent sacrifice, became a space of calm, reflection, and control. I moved through it freely, unburdened by expectations that were never mine to bear. Max called less frequently now, but when he did, his tone was tentative, sincere, and careful. He no longer assumed my compliance. He asked rather than demanded. He respected the boundaries I had set. Lena's messages, too, had changed. The frantic pleas, the desperate bargaining, the manipulative attempts, they were gone. In their place were acknowledgments of responsibility, apologies, and genuine gratitude. I sat at my kitchen table one morning, sipping coffee, and reflected on the transformation. The woman I had been, the silent enabler, the passive giver, was gone. In her place was someone who understood the value of her own time, energy, and love. Someone who had reclaimed her authority, her dignity, and her peace. The ledger, now neatly organized, served as both a record of past exploitation and a reminder of the power of boundaries. I glanced at the numbers one last time and closed the book with a sense of finality. The debts were being repaid, yes, but more importantly, the lesson had been learned. I began to rebuild my life on my own terms. Simple pleasures, long-neglected hobbies, quiet walks, and uninterrupted evenings became part of my daily routine. I took joy in activities I had once abandoned for the sake of others. I cooked for myself, read for myself, and celebrated small victories for myself. The world felt wider, freer, and more vibrant. One afternoon, Max and Lena came over, not out of necessity, but out of genuine desire to reconnect. They were calm, respectful, and careful with their words. They acknowledged the mistakes they had made, apologized sincerely, and shared their plans for repayment and rebuilding trust. I listened. I responded, measured and deliberate, setting boundaries that would ensure history did not repeat itself. And as I spoke, I realized something profound. The power of love is in its respect, not its exploitation. I could give, but only when boundaries were honored. I could care, but only when acknowledgment was mutual. And I could love, but only when it was appreciated and respected. That evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea, I felt a sense of liberation I had never known. The weight of decades of silent sacrifice had lifted. I had confronted betrayal, enforced accountability, and reclaimed my life. I was no longer invisible, no longer passive, and no longer defined by the expectations of those who had once exploited me. I thought of the future, free from manipulation, grounded in clarity, and filled with boundaries that would never again be ignored. Max and Lena would continue to learn, to grow, and to understand the value of honesty, respect, and acknowledgement, and I would continue to live fully, unapologetically, and on my own terms. For the first time in decades, I felt complete control over my life. My generosity was no longer a weapon against me, my love was no longer a tool for manipulation, and my presence was no longer invisible. The journey had been long, painful, and emotional, but it had brought me to a place of clarity, power, and self-respect. I was no longer a silent participant in my own life. I was the author of my own story, the architect of my own destiny, and the guardian of my own peace. And as the sun set, casting a golden light over the quiet streets, I smiled. I had been betrayed, humiliated, and taken for granted, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and unshakably in control. The past was accounted for, the lessons were learned, and the future, my future, was entirely mine. I was finally free.